When we think of greatness, what traits do we assign to it? Hard work, grit, resilience, dedication, perhaps even a bit of luck? While each of these play their part, they're actually all secondary. To develop each of these, those who reach the very top have to be something else first. Delusional, or more specifically, positively delusional. You have to convince yourself and others that you'll become the greatest in the world. You have to believe that your idea, which in its most practical sense is completely ridiculous, is actually something that could turn an entire industry on its head. And you have to deal with daily reminders that you're out of your mind when you voice your goals, aspirations, and dreams. Sounds crazy, right? Well, let's find out. This guy is Nigel Richard. In 2015, he won the French National Scrabble Championship. But here's the thing, he doesn't even speak French. Reportedly, he memorised the entire French Scrabble dictionary in just 9 weeks. Prior to his win, he'd won the World Scrabble Championship on numerous occasions, but that was all in English. And English Scrabble has around 187,000 possible words, whereas the French version has around 386,000. Despite his obvious skill for the game, if he told you, as someone who doesn't speak a single word of French, would go and win the French National Scrabble Championship in a couple of months, you would call him delusional. And you'd be right, because being delusional is not only associated to serious mental health conditions. In its rawest form, a delusion is a fixed belief that is not amenable to change in light of conflicting evidence. So Nigel's belief would have been, I can become French Scrabble champion. But that belief would have been met with mounds of conflicting evidence to argue against it. You could argue that such a belief is just self-belief. But a delusion is different from self-belief or self-confidence. Those are a bit more rooted in reality. You could have the self-belief or self-confidence of becoming a professional athlete, and that might be realistic given your pathway of development, your talent, and your work rate. But a delusion, that's something far-fetched, something near on impossible to fathom, like declaring that you'll become the greatest ever athlete in your entire sport. But that is exactly what's needed in order to get there. We can see this from this clip of Cristiano Ronaldo from around 2007 or 2008, when he and his teammates are asked who is the greatest player in the world ever.
Bono, who's the best player in the world ever?
For me, the best player in the world ever, Diego Maradona. Me.
And you can argue that he was somewhat joking, but the lack of hesitation was quite revealing. I think it did demonstrate that he does believe it, that perhaps he wasn't there just yet, but he honestly believed that he would become the greatest player ever. But at that point, it's just a delusional statement, because at that moment of his career, there was no evidence whatsoever to support that. But nearly 15 years later, he's done a pretty good job at laying his claim for the title of greatest footballer of all time. So to be positively delusional means you're willing to think beyond your existing limitations and capabilities, which is essential if you want to become elite at something. And we're not talking just good or even great, we're talking cream of the crop, best there is. But what are the consequences of becoming positively delusional, both good and bad? Well, in terms of the good, it allows you to do the impossible or the unfathomable. And we see this all the time in business. If you went to an investor 15 years ago saying you have a business idea where people go on a website to pay to sleep on an airbed in a random stranger's house, you would be called delusional. And if you said to a parent 15 years ago that instead of buying your teenager a car, you would voluntarily order a stranger from the internet to pick them up and drive them somewhere, you would be called delusional. Most people, after being called delusional, will politely pop their head back beneath the clouds. That crazy idea that they had or thought will not become a fixed, enduring delusion. But the positively deluded, they keep their head in the clouds. They're like a hot air balloon taking off in the wind after those on the ground failed to keep their grip on the ropes pulling it down. Positive delusions therefore have their main purpose in allowing you to be able to strive for and reach things previously unattainable. They're the ignition point to then carving out a pathway towards expertise, which is of course attained through a number of other things, but those other things won't emerge without being delusional to begin with. And these are not something that only a select few of us make. We all display delusions all the time. In hundreds of studies, it's been found that most people will place themselves above average on almost any category. And this is known as the Dunning-Kruger effect. Studies into this have shown that up to 42% of software engineers believe that they're in the top 5% on ability, 90% of academics place themselves above average, and 93% of Americans believe they're above average drivers. You don't have to be a mathematician to understand that those just don't add up. And the psychologist Jonathan Haidt has stated that evidence shows that people who hold pervasive positive illusions about themselves, their abilities and their future prospects are mentally healthier, happier and better liked than people who lack these illusions. But in the domain of high performance, the difference between the positive delusions and the Dunning-Kruger effect is that the former is more about potential rather than existing ability. Because believing in becoming elite and doing elite things leads to action, whereas already believing you're superior can lead to inaction. And like anything else, these delusions can have a dark side. They should sit beyond regular self-belief, but fall short of tipping over into arrogance, because that's what leads to complacency, outright deception, and potential harm for both yourself and those that your delusion ultimately impacts. We saw this with Elizabeth Holmes, the infamous founder of Theranos, a biotech company that sought to develop game-changing blood test services that meant from a single drop of blood, thousands of medical issues could be detected almost instantaneously. It was at first like any other delusion, one that sought to do something innovative or beyond the reaches of what seemed possible. And the company were clearly onto something. But the application of the Silicon Valley startup approach of move fast, break things was not suitable for something as process and research driven as medicine. A software bug is a nuisance, whereas a biotech bug could jeopardize people's health. And this approach at Theranos led to lies, deception, fraud, and indeed risks to the physical health of thousands of Americans. And Holmes now awaits her criminal trial set for March 2021. Delusion should therefore not be left to run wild once you start acting upon them. Think of them as a blind man who still needs his cane to navigate his environment. That cane are those key aspects of reality that you still need to hold on to in order to not trip over and let your delusion flail out of control. Positive delusions are at the heart of any pursuit towards excellence. Whether it's doing something science deemed physically impossible, building an industry-defining business in your garage, or simply declaring you'll be the best in the world at what you do. To do any of these things requires you to initially be delusional. And there's no set formula other than developing a fixed idea of what you want to do, become, or achieve. If you can hold on to that delusion and act upon it in the right way, then a lot of the time everything else can and will fall into place.